Okay, we're good.
Okay, well, Gavin and I are back to talk about the first two chapters from Jerry Coyne's book, uh, Faith versus Fact, Why Science and Religion Are Incompatible. And we have a few things we wanted to talk about before we start discussing the book itself, or the first two chapters anyways. Want to remind everyone where we are in the class. So basically today we'll cover the first half of Coyne's book, which is really just the first two chapters. Then next week we will cover the rest of the Coyne book, which is the last three chapters, I think. I think basically it's about evenly split. And so we'll wrap up Faith versus Fact next week, and then the last week of class, that's the seventh week, which is 2 weeks from today, right? Not next week, but the following week. That'll be our last class, or that'll be the last week of class, and that is, just looking at your syllabus, just make sure here. So right now we're at week 5, June 1st through the 6th. Next week is week 6, June 8th through the 13th. Then finally, week 7, June 15th through the 20th, we will discuss the full book, chapters 1 through 8. It's a little bit more reading than we've been doing, but I think the reading also is, I think generally students will find the reading moves quicker than the books we've read to this point, which isn't to say that the topics are necessarily easier to read or to think about. But I think my experience anyways, and experience of students doing exactly this class, is that that last book, Benatar's book, reads fairly straightforwardly, fairly clearly. But you guys, students, will be the judge of that. So we will cover the entire book, that is chapters 1 through 8 of The Human Predicament by David Benatar, the last week of class, June 15th through the 20th. And then on June 17th, we will send out, we will either email it to everyone or post it the final exam, and you will have 1 week to complete the final exam. And we'll say more about the final probably say a little bit more next week, and then of course the following week. When we send the final out, we'll give further instruction. But you will have, if we administer on the 17th, then yeah, that'll give you a full week, and it's due by noon on June 24th. Okay, so that's sort of the remaining structure for the class. Remember that in terms of your grades for this class, we hope it's not confusing or complicating. I mean, basically, there's the distribution is your grades are a function of 4 sort of categories or domains. There's the online discussion questions and responses. That's 1/4 of your grade, or 100 points. Each week you're posting 4 to 5 discussion questions, and you're answering at least 2 other students' discussion questions. So you're responding. You may not be answering those questions, but you're at least responding in some thoughtful way. There are the brief reaction papers, which are due 9 a.m. each Saturday. That's another 1/4 of your grade. Then there's I'm sorry, I misspoke, didn't I? The online discussion questions and responses together make up half your grade.
Yep.
Discussion questions are 1/4 of the grade. Responses are another 1/4 of the grade. So half your grade is keeping up with the discussion questions and responses. Another 25% is your brief reaction papers. And then finally, there's the comprehensive exam, which will be worth 25% of your grade. Okay, so I think for the most part, for all but a couple of people, everybody's keeping up with everything. And that's fantastic. That means that there are going to be a lot of A's in the class, and that's great. We've said it many times, and I'll just say it again, that it's really, really important to keep up. We still have 3 weeks of class left, including this week. And again, you've got your final coming up. So there's still lots to cover and lots to do. But hang in there. We only have, again, 2 weeks after this week, and then it's over. Okay, I want to say something about the videos for this week. Um, Gavin will be posting those videos, or have you posted them, Gavin?
By the time the video's up, they'll be posted.
Okay, so for this week, which is the first half of Coyne's book, we're asking you to watch the final 2 episodes of the PBS Evolution series. Part 6 is called The Mind's Big Bang, and it's basically applying evolutionary thinking to, to psychology, to the mind. And then Evolution, the PBS series, Evolution Part 7, which is the final part, that episode is titled What About God? And it's sort of, it's very timely because that's really where we're going this week and next week, is talking about the potential conflict or compatibility of religion and evolution. This PBS series, Part 7, what you will see is essentially the argument that there is no incompatibility between evolution and religion. Now, that's going to be in stark contrast to what Coyne argues, which is that there most certainly is conflict between religion and evolution. He actually makes an even broader argument between, fact fiction, or between science and religion. He casts a very wide net, but you will find that the PBS Evolution series comes down on one side and makes the case that there is no necessary conflict, where Coyne will argue that there is a necessary conflict. And we're not, this class isn't about you becoming committed to one side or the other. It's about you appreciating these different arguments and being exposed to these different arguments. So then we're also asking you to watch a lecture by Jerry Coyne. The title of that lecture is Evolution and Atheism, and then the subtitle is Best Friends Forever. And so he will make the case there. And essentially, this is a nice summary of his book. Not exactly focused on his book, but it's the same topics, certainly. And there he will make the case that evolution and atheism are 2 peas in a pod, basically. I mean, you'll have, of course, again, it's not about you committing to agreeing to what Coyne is arguing. It's about understanding what he's arguing, and finding the holes in what he's arguing, if there are holes in what he's arguing. That's a lecture that's about, I think it's about 45 or 50 minutes, and then there's about 20 or 25 minutes of questions where he gets peppered with questions from the audience. And I think it's really important to see how he does when he gets some very good questions. And so, again, I think while certainly Gavin and I encourage you to read the text of his book, this will provide you with a nice roadmap for what's to come in the next 3 chapters. So I'd recommend listening to his lecture on evolution and atheism before you tackle the next and final 3 chapters of his book. Finally, we thought it might be nice for you to check out a TV interview that Jerry Coyne did a couple of years ago when his book was published. And it's an interview with sort of a hard talk kind of setup. It's a news program, where the interviewer is, very directly questioning the author. I wouldn't say it's combative, but, he's not getting, the interviewer's not throwing him softballs. I mean, he's asking him legitimate questions, and he's basically asking Coyne to respond to, readers' concerns and readers' confusions, or, he's giving Coyne an opportunity to, expound on some of his statements in the book. And so that's about 20 minutes. It's very well done, and it also gives you a chance to see Coyne operating really off the cuff, and to see that he's an interesting guy. I think he's a likable guy, and he's also respectful in the way that he speaks. But I think that's part of the argument here is that you then will have read Coyne's argument in his book. You will have heard him give a lecture, and you will hear him in a sort of informal television interview sort of setting. So I think it gives you a well-rounded sense of what he's arguing, how he's arguing these things. And so I hope we hope that's useful. Gavin, is there anything else we want to add?
As far as anything that's coming up, no, not really. Did you want to touch on some of the issues students had last week with the reading?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
A lot of good questions, mostly about like smaller details about the second half of Dawkins' book, which I think are fine. But one of the biggest things, or one of the things I saw most frequently in the discussion forums, was sort of getting hung up on Dawkins' argument that the fossil record is not necessary in order to prove evolution. Like, a lot of people seemed to think it was odd that, or they even said, how is it that the hardest proof that we have for evolution is unimportant, according to Dawkins. And I don't want people to get too hung up on that, or to think... I'm not saying that he's wrong, but what I will say is that I think what he's trying to do is very strongly make the point, or very convincingly make the point that evolution is, like, there's a rock-solid case for it without the fossils. It's not that the fossils aren't great, like, amazing evidence for evolution. It's just that the case for it is already rock-solid without the fossils.
Yeah, I mean, and in fact, students may recall that Darwin himself made the argument that one doesn't even need the fossil record, given evidence and the many and varied domains from which the evidence was available, even in Darwin's time.
Right.
I mean, Darwin felt comfortable saying something like, even if I had not a single piece of fossil evidence, I would be convinced of of the truth value of my theory. And I think that's really where Dawkins is coming in. I mean, nowadays, of course, people could argue, I think, with Darwin at the time and say, come on, it might be real nice, to have that fossil record. That could really be helpful. He didn't think it was unimportant, but he thought it wasn't necessary. Well, Dawkins now, of course, with modern genetics and molecular genetics, and I mean, the evidence is just, it's so overwhelming now. I mean, the strongest evidence, most evolutionary biologists have argued that the strongest evidence in favor of evolution by natural selection is the molecular genetic evidence. The extent to which we share genes, and as a consequence of shared ancestry with all of these with every species on Earth. This can be documented, gene by gene, and that evidence is, incontrovertible. Fossil evidence, there's some ambiguity still, and people do sort of quibble about whether something should be categorized as this kind of organism or that kind of organism. But yeah, I think, Dawkins is making the case that it's not necessary, but it's incredibly useful and incredibly interesting, and all the fossil evidence we have to date is consistent with the truth value of evolution by natural selection.
Right.
So hope that's helpful for students, but continue to ask those kinds of questions, and we'll keep struggling with them with you.
Okay. So with that, did you want to say a few words about Coyne's book before we, start going into it chapter by chapter?
Let's see. I noticed that we didn't assign the preface, which is unfortunate. I think it would have been nice for students to read the preface. And let me just summarize the preface then. I mean, the point of the preface is basically, it's Coyne saying, why did I write this book? What am I doing here? And I think I think if you don't read it, you'll be fine. But I'd encourage students to read it because I think it helps to set the stage for the book itself. Coyne points out in the preface that he never really thought much about religion. He never really thought much about whether it was or wasn't in conflict with evolution. He studied as an evolutionary biologist, and of course he was aware that some, some evolution, some religions or religious, sort of sects felt strongly that evolution wasn't real, but he really never had much of a reason to worry about it or to think about it, or at least he didn't. He certainly didn't think about writing a book on whether they were compatible or incompatible. But what he did is he wrote a book called Why Evolution is True, and that was a book published about 10 years ago, I think, around the same time as Dawkins's book was published, which we read, The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution. Coyne published his Evidence for Evolution book about the same time. This happens to have been the 150th anniversary of Origin of Species, I believe. Either that or it was the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth. It was a significant time,
Right.
10 years ago. And so Coyne wrote his book and called Why Evolution is True. It was an excellent book. I've used it in many different classes as well. It's similar in many ways to Dawkins's book. And we read Dawkins's book rather than Coyne's book because we were going to read this book from Coyne, and I didn't want to have two of the same author. We didn't want to, thought it might be better for you guys to be exposed to two different authors as opposed to two books from the same author. Well, what Coyne discovered is that, he would go and give talks, and he writes about this in the preface. He would go and give talks about his new book, or his book at the time, Why Evolution is True. And he would present the evidence. It's overwhelming. It's just, in the words of Stephen Jay Gould, a Harvard biologist, paleontologist, Gould once said something to the effect that, there's so much evidence supporting evolution by natural selection as the explanation for life and all of its, variations, that it would be, what he argued is it would be perverse, to deny it. It's like saying the Earth is flat. It's at that level. People do deny it, and so presumably Gould would then say, well, then they're intellectually perverse. But you have to basically just ignore, a gigantic amount of data to argue that evolution is not true or evolution is false. So Coyne went around the country and around the world actually and gave talks on his book, and what he discovered is that after the talk, people would come up to him or send him emails or follow up with him and say, wow, the evidence is just, I did not realize how overwhelming the evidence was. I wasn't taught all this, and I didn't appreciate it. I find it, incontrovertible. But they would say, but I can't believe it. I can't believe it because my holy book, the Bible or the Quran, or my preacher or my priest tells me that it can't be right. And Coyne thought, that's weird. You're telling me that the evidence is utterly convincing, and yet you're not convinced. But you're not convinced because of a particular set of beliefs. And so he became convinced that the path to, educating people about the truth value of evolution by natural selection was not continuing to present them data. Instead, as he argues in this book, it's the path to recognition of the fact of evolution is disabusing people of religious beliefs. And basically with those beliefs that conflict with, the fact of evolution. And so he then wrote this book, which is Faith versus Fact. And this is basically his argument that despite what you may wish were true or what, many scientific organizations say or many religious organizations say, there is a profound conflict between science and religion, or between evolution and religion, and that it is not possible for them to be deeply compatible. He argues instead that they are deeply incompatible. And this is his book-length argument for why he thinks that. Have I left out anything worth further discussion?
In the preface, I don't think so, other than some stuff that we'll get into, I think, later.
Okay.
So, yeah, we can
All right. So why don't we start with chapter 1 then, the problem.
Right.
So, all right. So he says right at the beginning, this is on page 1, he says, well, he notes that, there are no heated discussions about reconciling sport and religion, or literature and religion, or business and religion. He says the important issue in today's world is the harmony between science and religion. Then he asks, but why, of all human endeavors that we could compare with religion, are we so concerned about its harmony with science? And he says the answer to him, at least, seems obvious. He says science and religion, unlike, say, business and religion, are competitors at discovering truths about nature. And science is the only field that has the ability to disprove the truth claims of religion, and has done so repeatedly. And then he notes the creation stories of Genesis and other faiths, the Noachian flood, and the fictitious exodus of the Jews from Egypt come to mind, all of which there's, a crushing amount of data that none of these things ever happened. He says, religion, on the other hand, has no ability to overturn the truths found by science. It is this competition and the ability of science to erode the hegemony of faith, but not vice versa, that has produced the copious discussion of how the two areas relate to each other and how to find harmony between them. So he's kind of setting it up, and he makes the case that, there's been conflict between science and religion, or science and faith, for millennia, for thousands of years, for as far back as the human record goes. There's been written record, that is, of conflict between science and religion. But he argues that it really wasn't until Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859. He argues that Darwin's book, more than any other, really brought this conflict to a head. And of course, that is the strategy. Well, that is the issue from Darwin, as we've discussed. I mean, Darwin is hitting his scientific theory of evolution by natural selection against the non-scientific religious theory of special creation. They are utterly in conflict, insofar as, once you accept that life exists, right? And remember, Darwin didn't want to get into, what about before that? How did life get there? He was happy to just ignore that for now. Excuse me. But it was really in 1859, so Darwin's Origin of Species, where the conflict really became unavoidable to some extent. The discussion of the conflict became unavoidable.
Right. And I sort of wonder why exactly that is the case for Darwin's book, when there had been so much conflict between other truth claims, is what Jerry Coyne calls them in this book. Truth claims made by religion conflicting with, contrary scientific evidence, and he talks about other major points of conflict, like the Scopes monkey trial, and then, the Galileo's lifetime house arrest over the heliocentric theory of the universe.
Yeah, so there certainly was conflict. Actually, with the Scopes trial, that was like in the 1920s, wasn't it?
Yeah, he talks about that on the next page. But
But you're right. I mean, with Galileo and Copernicus, there were the conflicts between science and religion. I don't know if he actually ends up answering why Darwin's book, sort of stirred up this conflict to its present, status. I think in part because, I think in part is because Darwin made such a straightforward, reasonable, and well-argued case that it made it very, very difficult for people to ignore. And I think at that time too, remember Darwin was writing for, and his book was read by, sort of the average person interested in, science and religion, and biology and theology. So, I mean, it was an incredibly well published book and well purchased book, I guess you could say.
Right.
I mean, with the first run of the copies, sold out in a day, I think.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think The first run was 1,250 copies, and they were gone. Actually, they were already gone before they were published. No, they were pre-ordered, basically. You'd say pre-ordered. But quickly, it it was reprinted, and people just kept buying it. I think they were interested. I think they were fascinated. It may have been just the timing as well. And that's a time when the average person could purchase a book. It became possible. You didn't have to be extremely wealthy to have the means to purchase a book. It became something that anybody could get a hold of,
Right.
And they did for various reasons. And I mean, again, the conflict between science and religion in Darwin's Origin of Species is fairly circumscribed. So it's basically Darwin specifically arguing against the theory of special creation. He's not arguing against, the existence of God or gods. He's certainly not arguing that. He's arguing that his theory of evolution by natural selection provides a more parsimonious and evidence-based account for life as we know it.
Right.
And again, as we've talked about, and as we will talk about, there are millions and millions of religious people who accept the fact of evolution by natural selection, including Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, of all religious leanings. There are, large chunks that recognize the fact of evolution and that don't have any problem. I'm just saying, they can say they claim not to have any conflict between the two.
Right.
I mean, whether there is conflict, nevertheless, is a separate question. And I think Coyne makes the argument that there is. You cannot, at a very basic level, accept something on evidence and sort of be guided by evidence in one domain or in one part of an argument, and then accept on faith, that is without evidence, some other feature of that argument. He argues that that's a conflict, that there's an incompatibility there in the appreciation and respect for evidence.
Right. And so it is interesting. Just to sort of preempt, I think, what some people might have questions about with this book, or might struggle with as they start to read it, is, he addresses it partially in the preface and also in chapter 1. Why did Coyne write this book, or why did he feel the need to write this book and put forward these arguments? Because I feel like you could potentially say, why does he have to make enemies, or why does he have to be so contrarian as to insist that science and religion aren't compatible? Wouldn't it be better, as he says that some scientists say, wouldn't it be better to just make friends with the people on the other side of the aisle and
Right.
admit that science and religion are compatible and try and find middle ground? Because then, at least then, you have a chance of convincing them of some of the truths made by science, as some people have had some success in doing. And that's
Right.
why I think it's useful that in this chapter, first of all, he lays out what sorts of religions he's talking about when he says that
Yes.
faith and fact are incompatible. And then amongst those, the ones that make theistic claims about a god, and in particular, the religions that he says make truth claims about the nature of the universe, or the nature of reality. Those are the ones that are in conflict and will always be in conflict with science, even if, as we talked about in previous videos, God kind of keeps getting pushed back as religious people, or people who accept things on faith, keep accepting more scientific truths or scientific observations about the universe. They just keep pushing God back, further and further.
Yeah, and Gavin, does he define what he means by religion yet? Has that been defined, or does he do that next? Oh, I think he does it next, right? Where he's talking about what is religion, and so he clearly has to make this distinction.
Right.
He has to identify what he means by religion. And yeah, so yes, I mean, you're absolutely right that, I mean, he has to define what he means by science and what he means by religion. And Gavin, you're right that he clearly identifies theistic religion as what he's talking about. That is where there's a god or gods that actually play an active role in the lives of people, or at least people think that these god or gods play an active role. So they're prayed to, they're asked for favors, they expect, there's a certain code of conduct that they believe that the god or gods is, sort of commanding. So it's a personal god,
Right.
and that's what he means by religion. So he's not talking about things like Taoism or, Jainism or something like deism, which is the argument that there's just an impersonal sort of force, that got the universe going, and then that's it. There's never any actual interaction with the natural world.
Right.
To that extent, he wouldn't see necessarily any conflict. He believes that the conflict, Coyne's argument that the conflict comes when a religion proposes, or proposes that there is a personal God, like the Christian God or Muslim God.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, what most people think of as religion, what most people practice, that is most statistically. I mean, the Abrahamic religions make up more than half of religious believers, and therefore most religious believers believe in some kind of personal God. And anytime you invoke a personal God, you're invoking a God that has some interaction with reality, with nature, actually changes things and does things. He argues that those are places in which science and religion come into conflict, when they're both offering explanations or attempting to offer explanations for things that happen in the natural world.
Right. And he also, sort of along those lines, makes the case that, it is sort of necessary for him to make these arguments because there are, as you said, a pretty significant statistical majority of people in most countries do believe not only in these, like the big three religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, but also amongst those people, most of them do believe, because he kind of sets up the counter argument that, well, you're making mountains out of molehills, or you're making the claim that everyone who claims to be a Christian Jew or is Islamic believes in like a monotheistic God that has a direct influence over the world, but that's not actually the case, or they believe more in like a nebulous sort of power that doesn't really control things. And Jerry Coyne argues that no, amongst those, most people do believe in a personal God that, or in like new earth creationism. Like the things he's saying are problematic and in conflict with science is exactly what most people of most religions do believe.
That's right. Yeah. And that's an important point, is that, people would accuse Coyne of basically missing the target, because most people don't. That's exactly right. I mean, most people don't really believe in a personal God. They don't really believe this stuff. But according to most people's self-reports, they do believe this stuff. I mean, we know from this class that more than 40% of Americans, for example, think that God created humans in their current form less than 10,000 years ago. That's dramatically inconsistent with the evidence. And that's exactly the kind of belief system that Coyne is talking about. That is deeply in conflict and utterly incompatible with the facts on the ground for evolution by natural selection. And that's what he's talking about. He's not setting up a straw man where nobody really believes this, and he's making like all these people believe this, but that's not true. No, I mean, if you take people at their word, people do believe this. People do believe in a God. People really do believe, for example, that Jesus is the Son of God, also God, was crucified, died, came back to life, okay, and by the way, was birthed by Mary, who was conceived by God immaculately. People claim to actually believe these things, not as a metaphor or as sort of a stand-in for what really might have happened. No, they believe that it did happen. And so Coyne, I think it's important that Coyne addresses that potential criticism, because that's what a lot of not a lot, but there are, of course, theologians and what he refers to as sophisticated theologians who say they don't actually believe in these things. They recognize that they're just metaphors. In which case I don't think Coyne would have any problem with that. But it's when you actually believe that's where the conflict hits the road. So yeah, good point. He at the end of this chapter, the problem is the conflict between science and religion. That's the problem that we're trying to address here. And he's got to convince the reader that there really is a problem. And I think there is a problem. I think that's what he wants to argue, is that there is a problem. This isn't a worthless effort to set this up as a potential conflict. There is potential conflict if you look at what people actually say they believe.
Right.
And he says, so at the top of page 23, he says, I could go on, but the point is clear. Religions make explicit claims about reality, about what exists and happens in the universe. Okay, these claims involve the existence of gods, the number of such gods, their character and behavior, how they interact with the world, whether or not there are souls or life after death, and above all, how the deities wish us to behave, their moral code. These are empirical claims. And although some may be hard to test, they must, like all claims about reality, be defended with a combination of evidence and reason. He says, if we find no credible evidence, no good reasons to believe, then those claims should be disregarded, just as most of us ignore claims about ESP, astrology, and alien abduction. After all, beliefs important enough to affect you for eternity surely deserve the closest scrutiny. So he continues on. Blah, blah, blah. Let's see. He says on page 24, throughout this book, we'll encounter not only the kinds of empirical claims made by the faithful, but also the ways that different religions make different and contradictory claims that have often led to religious schisms. Like the branching tree of biological life itself, religions have splintered and proliferated in ways that have created new sects that can be placed in a genealogy of faith. Just as there are millions of species, so there are thousands of faiths. And then he says the diversity of their conflicting claims suggests that we should be skeptical about the tenets of every faith. But we'll also examine the ways that believers, knowing the fragility of such claims, try to insulate themselves from having their empirical claims tested or even discussed. Then he closes this chapter. Let me just make one other comment here. He says on page 25, it does not seem misguided to me or an insult to believers to regard God and much religious dogma as hypotheses. As we'll see in the next chapter, religions regularly make statements about what exists in the cosmos, and believers' acceptance of those statements, as well as their rejection of empirical claims made by other religions, ultimately depends on what they consider to be evidence. And then Coyne asks, is it disrespectful to take the claims of believers seriously and examine them rationally and scientifically, especially when so much of modern society, including law, politics, and morality, rests on those claims? So he argues that it's not disrespectful. It's the opposite of disrespectful. It's respectful to consider them seriously and ask, what is the evidence?
Right. So do you feel as though, based on the arguments Coyne has put forth in this chapter, that he is saying more or less that any religion or belief system that does make truth claims about. I mean, obviously, he's saying that any religion that makes truth claims about the universe that are in conflict with evidence are therefore in conflict with science. But in order for them to no longer be in conflict with science, it sort of seems like he's implying or saying explicitly at some points that they would kind of need to walk their truth claims back to the point to where their religion no longer has any sort of faith. It's no longer taking anything or making any claims about the universe based on faith, and it's no longer making any like sort of hard theistic statements, and would be more comparable to, like you said, Jainism or some forms of Buddhism that make almost wholly philosophical claims and no sort of truth claims about nature.
Right. That's exactly what Coyne is arguing, is that, and there are many religions that have done exactly that. They sort of walked back, their truth claims as science has advanced. Not all of them have, of course, but those are often regarded as sort of archaic. We'll get into this more as we sort of move into the next few chapters. But yes, he's arguing, in short, any religion that sort of revises its truth claims so that it's not in conflict with the evidence of science, he argues will no longer be a religion as we think about it. It will no longer have, you can call it whatever you want, but he would argue that it's no longer a religion in the sense that he's talking about, where you have a direct personal God who is infiltrating reality and having an effect on nature and observable sort of phenomena. And you'll be left with, some version of secular humanism or some sort of, broad philosophy. And of course there are, as a matter of fact, versions of Christianity and Islam and Judaism that really are only, let's just take Christianity, they're only nominally Christian. I mean, they've dropped all of the sort of conflicting potential, the conflicting theology. So, they no longer claim it's necessary that, Jesus was actually immaculately conceived, or that Jesus actually died and then rose from the dead, or that, they talk about these things as metaphorical. Well, when you do that, you then find that you're dramatically in conflict now with the majority of Christian believers who think that, the resurrection of Christ is sort of, that's, you can't, but that actually has to have happened. If that didn't happen, then if Jesus didn't actually die for everyone's sins, well then what is Christianity about? And so, but that doesn't stop them from continuing. And the point being, Coyne wouldn't have any arguments with that sort of Christian. That's just by Christian in name, in some sense,
right.
Nominal Christian. Yeah. Okay. And he says, again, right at the end of chapter 1, he says, if there is a common theme in the writings of those who see religion and science as incompatible, it is the idea that in science, faith is a vice, while in religion, it's a virtue. It is this incompatibility that upsets believers when skeptics use reason to scrutinize the tenets of their faith, whether those tenets involve the resurrection, the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, or the reward of a coterie of virgins in paradise for religious martyrdom. The rational scrutiny of religious faith involves asking believers only two questions. How do you know that? And what makes you so sure that the claims of your faith are right and the claims of other faiths are wrong? Okay, and he concludes with, I've argued that there's plenty of evidence, some involving people's perception, that the purported harmony between science and religion is not what it's cracked up to be. In other words, that there's not the kind of harmony that you might have been led to believe. In the next chapter, he says, I'll go beyond perception and give my own explanation for why these areas are irredeemably incompatible. Okay. Anything further, or shall we move on to chapter 2?
No, I think that covers it. So chapter one is basically, it's titled "What's the problem?" The problem is that these two things are incompatible, and then chapter two basically lays out what is incompatible between the two, and he goes sort of step by step explaining.
And step by step, in terms of first, he defines what is science, what do we mean by science, and he notes that, more than anything, it is a method. And as he says on page 28, there are many ways in which you could talk about science. What does it mean? Well, again, you have to be clear about what you mean, or he has to be clear. He must be clear about what he means. And he says, this is at the bottom of page 28, science, what he means by science is simply a method for understanding how the universe, and then parenthetically matter, our bodies and behavior, the cosmos, and so on, actually works. Okay? Science is a set of tools refined over hundreds of years for getting answers about nature. Okay? There's nothing magical involved here. Okay? He goes on to say, on page 29, like at the top of page 29, like everyone, scientists can suffer from confirmation bias, which is our tendency to pay attention to data that confirm our a priori beliefs and wishes, and to ignore data that we don't like. Okay? But you embrace that likely bias in science. You recognize that bias and do what you can to work against that bias. And so doubt and criticality, as he says here, the doubt and criticality of science are there precisely for the reason that Feynman and others have emphasized, to prevent us from believing what we'd like to be true. A religion, on the other hand, he says, is replete with features to help people fool themselves, okay, to not recognize where you might be operating on a confirmation bias, only looking for things that you want to find, okay? And he defines truth as, the bottom of page 29, truth is simply what is, okay, what exists in reality and can be verified by rational and independent observers. Okay? A lot of this is just being, his efforts to be very clear about what he's talking about. Finally, I'll mention at the top of page 30, he says, scientific truth, and this is important, is never absolute, okay, but provisional. There is no bell that rings when you're doing science to let you know that you finally reached the absolute and unchangeable truth and need go no further. Absolute and unalterable truth is for mathematics and logic, not empirically based science. As the philosopher Walter Kaufmann explained, what distinguishes knowledge is not certainty, but evidence. And then, of course, evidence can change. So I would say this is actually, I think we've said this before, but in science, there is no shame in saying, I don't know, in recognizing that there are things that either we don't know or we're not confident about or we need more evidence on. Whereas often, not always, but often in religion, religious beliefs often turn on what you absolutely know to be true. Why do you know it's true? Because you read it in a holy book, or because a religious leader told you it was true. And in fact, it's often considered unseemly or irreligious to ask, well, how do we know that? Or to have doubts about the truth value of religious claims. Quite the opposite occurs in science. It is expected that one approaches scientific evidence with a critical eye, with a questioning eye, with doubt, and expecting to be convinced based on evidence.
Yes, and I think it's interesting that his description of what is science in this section of the book reminds me a bit of Dawkins' explanation of what a theory is as a heuristic tool for making predictions, and it's a heuristic tool that can be proven wrong at any point if we find evidence that contradicts, how the theory is proposed to work.
Yes, that's a good point. And one of the things we've mentioned, Gavin, in these lectures or these discussions is, multiple times. So we do still call it the theory of evolution by natural selection. But then we've also pointed out that evolution by natural selection is as close to a fact as we have. Um, what we mean there is that the evidence is so strong, it's so multifarious, it comes from so many different domains. I mean, it's, again, as Stephen Jay Gould argued, the nature of the evidence is such that it would be perverse to deny evolution by natural selection as fact.
Right.
Nevertheless, it is possible that we will find evidence, that we or somebody else will find evidence that causes us to call into question the validity of evolution by natural selection. You know, fossil rabbits in the Precambrian, for example. I'm not so sure that would actually cause us to completely throw out evolution by natural selection, but it would certainly cause us to massively revise our understanding of, you know, the sequence with which paleontological evidence is, you know, laid down. But at any rate, the point is, evolution by natural selection is the single best explanation we have for life and for the diversity of life and distribution of life and the fossil record and, you know, molecular genetic evidence. But that's not to say, if we want to be sticklers, we wouldn't say evolution is true. We would say it's, you know, it's extraordinarily well supported by the evidence collected to date.
Right.
But the reason you don't say, you might not say it's not, the reason you might not say it's true is because you're saying there's no chance ever that any evidence could ever be collected that would show that it was false. And that's actually not the case.
Right. Yeah, you could say that the theory of natural selection is consistent with every observation we've made thus far, but you couldn't make the same claim about religious faith.
Correct. That's his argument. That's right.
So.
Okay, so then what he does in the remainder of this chapter, so here he's basically getting at what's incompatible. Okay, what is incompatible? What does it mean, incompatible? He goes through and he defines science. Then at some point soon he'll define religion. But he takes you through, starting on page 33, he says, there are, however, some important features that distinguish science from pseudoscience, from religion, and from what are euphemistically called, quote, other ways of knowing. Okay, and he begins with falsifiability via experiments or observations. He makes the case that that science advances, okay, on the basis of falsifiability, on the basis of observable evidence, okay, not on the basis of private revelation, for example. That's one area in which there's, you know, there are distinguishing features between science and non-science. Okay, is the importance of falsifiability. In other words, the importance of being able to show that something is false. Okay, there has to be a mechanism by which you can demonstrate that a particular scientific argument is false. If you can never show that something is false, well then you'd have good reason to never feel very good about it being likely to be true.
Right.
As he says in the very last sentence, he says, in the end, a theory that can't be shown to be wrong can never be shown to be right. And then, of course, it's not the status of evolution by natural selection. There are thousands of previous attempts to document the falsity of evolution by natural selection, all of which to date have failed.
Mm-hmm. And is it worth mentioning also that there are plenty of religious advocates that actually agree on that point, but as an argument for religion, saying that, well, of course you can't prove religion, you can't prove God. It's not, you know, it's, my religion is based on faith, it's not based on facts. But then that's, you know, just more evidence for what Coyne is saying is exactly the problem, which is that, you know, you're either ignorant of the facts or you are willfully ignoring the facts that we know in science to be true in order to accept your religion, which is problematic for, you know, lots of reasons that he gets into.
Exactly. Yes. Right. I mean, you could say, people do say, well, my religion, right, as you just indicated, is not based on facts, based on faith. Well, you can't decide not to accept as a fact that which is a fact. I mean, the fact that millions of people believe that the Earth is flat doesn't make it flat. The Earth is not flat. We know it's not flat based on the evidence. So, yeah, I mean, you can close your eyes and, and put your fingers in your ears, but it doesn't. That's not engaging with the evidence. That's not engaging with, and maybe they'll say, well, I don't care. Well, but the thing is, most religious people most religions anyways, do make claims about the natural world and do make claims about the empirical state of things. And therefore, and to that extent, those claims will be in conflict or could be in conflict with the scientific evidence.
Right.
So,
and I think that's more so what the next section on what is religion is about. Because, I mean, you could go in circles all day talking about the different ways that religious people do sort of try to get around scientific evidence. But I think he addresses the most prominent, which is that, religion, as he is defining it, does make faith claims that are inconsistent, or truth claims that are inconsistent with scientific evidence.
Yes, right. And then in the rest of this section on what is science, he also points out the important role of doubt and criticality, the important role of replication and quality control. I mean, one of the things about science is you never take something on faith. Mm-hmm. I mean, you wouldn't believe something just because somebody said it was true. I mean, that's precisely what science is not about. You believe that which has been shown to be a fact. You believe that for which there is evidence. You don't believe on the basis of, oh, well, Coyne said it or Richard Dawkins said it. I mean, for that reason, just because Darwin wrote about it doesn't make it true.
Right.
There's a place where Coyne talks about, I mean, there is no, when you're getting your PhD in biology, you don't put your hand on the origin of species and swear your allegiance to the theory of evolution by natural selection. That would fly in the face of everything that science stands for, which is always to question. Never accept that which you're told without appropriate evidence.
Yes, exactly.
He goes on to argue that an important feature of science is parsimony. The theories, the scientific theories should not be any more complicated than need be. They should only be as complicated as the data warrant or as the evidence warrants. He talks a little bit about living with uncertainty. And he notes that in the end, it's from a scientific perspective, from a scientist's perspective, it's our ignorance that moves science forward. It's what we don't know that moves science forward. And I think he actually begins this section with one of the most common statements we hear in science is, I don't know. Scientific papers, even those that report fairly solid findings, are hedged with statements like, this suggests that, or if this finding is correct, or this result should be verified by further experiments. Granted, scientists are people, and we'd like to know all the answers, but in the end, it's our ignorance that moves science forward.
Oh, sorry, my cat is... Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, especially... He does, I'm not sure if it's here that he makes the claim that religion has not similarly moved forward in any significant way I feel like you could make the argument that most religions really haven't moved forward since their inception, or that they're really incapable of moving forward in the same sense.
Right. And not only that, but many religions pride themselves on that and actually use that as an argument. They make the case that, well, the reason it hasn't moved forward in 2,000 years is because we already found the truth.
Right.
So anyway, he'll talk a little bit about that later.
Okay.
But then Coyne says, this is also on page 37, he says, it's no shame to admit it, for without the unknown, there would be no science, nothing to spark our curiosity. But that attitude assumes that there are some answers we might never know. So again, there's no shame in saying, I don't know. Let's see what the evidence says.
Right. And I mean, it is in a sense, a strength of science,
Yeah.
because that is exactly what moves it forward. And again, because science has heuristic tools, as you know, we've said before, theories for discovering what is true. It's designed in a way to where claiming ignorance or saying I don't know is a benefit, and it is what moves science forward. And because religion is very much not set up that way, it does not have heuristic tools, and it does not make theories in the same sort of way. It's not set up to move forward in the same sense that science is.
Right. That's right. And then he goes on to suggest that living with uncertainty is hard for many people and is one of the reasons why people prefer religious truths that are presented as absolute. It's, it may not be comfortable. Well, it's often not comfortable to know that you don't know. But that is the mindset of a scientist, is to appreciate that you don't know everything. You don't have all the answers. You don't know the absolute truth. He talks a little bit about, after that, he talks a little bit about the collective nature of science. And he notes very straightforwardly on page 39, there is only one, there isn't, well, he points out, okay, he says, although scientists come in all faiths, including no faith at all, there is no Hindu science, no Muslim science, no Jewish science. There's only science, combining brainpower from the whole world to produce one accepted body of knowledge. In contrast, there are thousands of religions, most differing profoundly in what they see as true. Okay?
Yeah. And that, I think, goes in line with what you were just saying a second ago. That, science is consistent, not only across disciplines a lot of the time in places where disciplines overlap, but within disciplines, scientists or, molecular biologists in Germany and the United States and Japan are all going to be in agreement with one another, where different sects within Christianity, different churches within, Southern Baptists are going to disagree about interpretations of the Bible.
Right. Yeah, and the question is, well, how do they know who's right?
Exactly.
And if you can't find some objective way to establish who's right, then how do you determine that any of them are right? Or what's to suggest that any of them are likely to be right?
Yeah, and in that sort of sense, I think it's interesting because religion in a lot of ways is just more comparable to like a philosophy, because and even then, that's assuming that the religions are making claims about philosophical beliefs or morality, but that's, of course, not always the case. They do also make claims about nature, and then they conflict amongst themselves and almost always with science. So,
right. So that gets us into, why don't we just move to, we've talked a little bit about this, but on page 41, he then addresses, okay, we've talked about what is science, now let's talk about what is religion. Okay, and I think he fairly, to move forward, he's not talking about religion broadly conceived. He's talking about a particular way of doing religion, which he argues is what most people think of when they think of religion. So he notes, one can derive three characteristics of religion from this definition, all part of the Abrahamic faiths. So the definition, incidentally, is action, religion. He defines as, it's actually a definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. It says action or conduct indicating belief in, obedience to, and reverence for a god, gods, or similar superhuman power, the performance of religious rites or observances. Okay, and he says, so one can derive three characteristics of religion from this definition, all part of the Abrahamic faiths. And he's going to focus on the Abrahamic faiths, as he points out earlier on this page, because these comprise 54% of the world's inhabitants, the religious world's inhabitants. And so, you gotta start somewhere. But it's also recognizing that he's not trying to explain he's not addressing every possible variation on religion.
Yes.
Instead, his definition turns on these three characteristics. The first is theism, okay, at the bottom of page 41, the claim that God interacts with the world. Okay, if anything is a religion, it has to be a theistic religion. The second feature of religion is its embrace of a moral system. Okay, if the supernatural agent confers or denies approval based on obedience, that means there are behaviors and thoughts that are either worthy or unworthy of that approval, including obedience itself. Okay, and then three, codes of morality imply the third trait of religion, the idea that God interacts directly with you in a personal relationship. Okay, so there's direct interaction of a personal nature with a God that has an effect, right? A God or gods that has some effect, and that describes most religious people's belief systems. Not all, but most.
Right.
So he proceeds to address a variety of questions one can ask about religion, beginning with, does religion look for truth? And he tackles the issue of the existence of God, and he notes that the existence of God is often simply taken as a fact, and it's not sort of subject to, evidence-based critical thinking. It's basically taken as fact and not questioned. On page 47, he notes that existence claims about gods are clearly empirical claims that require some kind of evidence. And although they can be hard to test depending on the kind of God you worship, advocates of theism argue that God's interventions in the universe should be detectable. Okay, and he wants to argue, Coyne argues then, that where expected evidence of God or expected detectable evidence of God is not found, well, parsimony suggests that we conclude, at least tentatively, that God doesn't exist. If the expected detectable evidence for that God is not found, well, if we were talking about anything else besides, religion, we'd say, well, I guess it doesn't exist then, tentatively. And that's certainly not the strategy that's often taken by many people with religious beliefs.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it almost seems as though most existence claims about God sort of immediately jump to the assertion that he is undetectable, immediately jumps to the unfalsifiable hypothesis that, he's not tangible in any sense, doesn't exist on this plane of reality, possibly because there's just, no way that anyone would ever find any sort of evidence for something resembling a God through any known method of scientific observation.
Well, Coyne will argue that all empirical claims can in principle be tested.
Well, right.
Even if it's very difficult to do so.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
So like the Shroud of Turin, the shroud that covered Jesus, that was purported to be the cloth that covered Jesus in his tomb. There was, the Vatican, I think, had proposed that this was the Shroud of Turin. This was the shroud that covered Jesus. And they themselves allowed 3 independent labs to test, to date this shroud. And of course, if it's really the Shroud of Jesus, it should date to about 2,000 years ago. Okay, but in each one of the labs, using modern dating technology, dated it to, between 1300s and 1500s.
Right.
So it could possibly have been the Shroud of Turin. So it was an existence claim. It was a claim, an empirical claim that was falsified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, so in principle, all of these things can be tested.
Yeah, and I guess maybe I was a little too harsh with my claim earlier that people tend to immediately go to unfalsifiable existence claims about God, because many religions do also have plenty of stories that people take literally about God interacting directly with the natural world, such as the flood.
Right.
So
Yeah. Well, um, I mean, some of them may be very, very difficult to test, but in principle, many of these claims are testable empirical claims. So the claim that all humans descended from Adam and Eve, for example, has been roundly refuted by the evidence. Now, that evidence is not in conflict with the proposal that Adam and Eve are only metaphorically the first humans, as presented in Genesis. And that's, of course, exactly what many Christians will argue. They'll say, there wasn't an actual Adam and Eve. Okay, so that's only metaphorical Adam and Eve. Well, but they must know that there are millions of Christians that's part of their belief system, is that there really was an Adam and Eve. So you can shift your belief away from an actual claim and just say, no, I was never claiming anything. That's not what I meant. I mean, I know it's metaphorical. Then of course, you might want to know, as would many of their co-religionists, well, what makes you think it's metaphorical? How do you know it's metaphorical? And that's where things get interesting, because it comes down to one interpretation against another interpretation, and no evidence in support of either.
exactly. And then, so he does talk about other empirical claims of religion besides gods.
Right. Yeah, I mean, he takes you through the Nicene Creed at the end of page 49 and on page 50. He's boldened the empirical claims in this creed that is professed by many Christians. These are statements, these empirical claims are statements of actual, they purport to be statements of fact, statements about which there should be empirical evidence. And in each case, these can be tested. Right?
Yeah, yep.
So part of what he's arguing is that religions do, in fact, make empirical claims. Okay, despite what they may say, most religions, make claims about empirical reality.
Yeah,
Okay?
and
Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, and I don't think he's going to greater lengths than necessary to make that point, right? Because I mean,
Right.
as he provides in this section of the chapter, there are many, many examples of religions making testable empirical claims about nature and about history a lot of the time. And especially because, I mean, this may not be as strong of evidence, but there are so many, subsects of religions that are based on empirical claims, like subsects of Christianity, like Quakers and Protestants and Baptists, that define their entire subsect on an interpretation of a piece of the Bible that is more or less a testable truth claim.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, another point that Coyne makes, I don't want to skip over it, is that many people argue that, let's just stick with the Abrahamic faiths, that, let's just say Christians, they don't really believe literally in the things that are purported to have occurred in the Bible. They don't really believe in, that God created, that God took dust to create Adam, and then took a rib out of Adam to create, Eve. They don't really believe that. Well, I mean, that's not actually true. Not if you look at what they actually say. As he takes you through the evidence on 52 and 53, no polls show that most believers see Scripture metaphorically rather than literally. Most believers see their Scripture literally. God really did poof humans into existence. God really did poof Eve into existence using only Adam's rib. Again, these are claims about reality. These are empirical claims, and people actually, if you take them at their word, they believe this. So he's not setting up a so-called straw man. There really are many more literalists than there are metaphoricalists.
Mm-hmm. And he continues that argument on page 54 with, is scripture literal or allegorical? And then
Right.
I think here, instead of talking explicitly about the statistics of what people believe, he talks about sort of the inconsistency with claiming that certain parts of religious texts are allegorical, and how, on the bottom of page, or the second half of page 54, he talks about how one by one the claims are morphed from literal truths into allegories. But then, there's so many problems with doing that. I sort of feel like, I mean, maybe other religious people disagree, but I sort of feel like if you are going to start making particular claims about allegories in the Bible, you kind of have to just flip the whole thing on its head and say the whole thing is allegorical, rather than going piece by piece as people seem to do. But
Right. And if that's the case, if the whole thing is just an allegory, and there's not really a God, or Jesus really wasn't, the Son of God, he wasn't really crucified and rose from the dead, and all the rest of it, well, then that's not the sort of religion that will be in conflict with science. It doesn't fit theism, the core components that Coyne just mentioned. That's not what he's talking about. If you've sort of stripped out all of the existence claims, all the empirical claims, well, then there likely will be no conflict, because you're not any longer making empirical claims that could be in conflict with science.
exactly.
Right. Okay, so let's see here. See. There's a section where it kind of comes to a head here on page 58, 59. He says, let's see. If you want to read much of the Bible as allegory, top of page 59, you must overturn the history of theology, rewriting it to conform to your liberal, science-friendly faith. Besides pretending that you're following in the tradition of ancient theologians, you must also explain the way you can discern truth amid the metaphors. What is allegory and what is real? How do you tell the difference? This is particularly difficult for Christians, he says, because the historical evidence for Jesus, that is, for a real person around whom the myth accreted, is thin. And evidence for Jesus as the Son of God is unconvincing, resting solely on the assertions of the Bible and interpretations of people writing decades after the event described in the Gospels. He goes on to say, if faith is often grounded on facts, we might expect one of two results if those facts were shown to be wrong. Either people would abandon their faith or put some parts of it, or they would simply deny the evidence that contradicted their beliefs. And then he goes on to say, unfortunately, as we've seen, he reminds the reader, 64% of Americans would retain a religious belief even if science disproved it, while only 23% would consider changing that belief. 41% in another study of British Christians, 41% of whom agreed or tended to agree with the statement, if science contradicts the Bible, I will believe Bible, not science. That's a clear instance in which there's a conflict between religion and science.
Right. And I think also sort of gets at the idea that people do. It's interesting how people see them as conflicting, although there's like also a fundamental difference in why they believe in their religion versus how they're convinced by science. Because it is sort of, to me, the statistic is saying that people will, if shown contradictory evidence, will believe in their religion because they value the process of faith more than the process of science. Sort of. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and then he tackles evolution. He calls it, on page 59, evolution the biggest problem. He argues that, and that's sort of the basis of this particular class, is that evolution provides sort of a jumping off point for the potential for conflict between science and religion, or faith and fact. And he points out that, of course, we know that, as of, he says, a 2014 Gallup poll, this is top page 60, fully 42% of Americans were straight biblical young earth creationists, agreeing that humans were created in our present form within the last 10,000 years. Another 31% were theistic evolutionists, accepting evolution with the caveat that it was supernaturally guided or prompted by God. And only 19% of Americans, fewer than 1 in 5, accepted evolution the way biologists do, as a natural, unguided process. Then he argues that this rejection of evolution can't be explained simply by Americans' ignorance of the evidence. That was partly, again, what caused him to write this book.
Right.
It's not that they aren't exposed to the evidence. I mean, people like Richard Dawkins, Carl Sagan, David Attenborough, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Edward O. Wilson, flood, the nonfiction sections of our bookstores, online and in print, and also, entire television channels are dedicated to, promoting and, alerting people to the latest science. He argues the reason instead is clear, that, he says here, yet evolution is rejected by Americans as strongly today as it was 3 decades ago, despite the fact that we have so much more information available. He argues that the reason is clear. When asked in the bottom of page 60, when asked in 2007 why they denied evolution, Americans gave as the main reason their belief in Jesus. 19% of respondents, God, 16% of respondents, or religion in general, another 16% of respondents, all exceeding those who thought there was, quote, not enough evidence for evolution, 14%. Let's see. Nevertheless, regardless of how science-savvy they are, the religious deny the fact of evolution much more often than do the non-religious. In fact, the more the faithful know about science, the more they reject evolution. This errant rejection of facts is clearly based not on lack of education or ignorance, but on religious belief.
Right.
That seems to be what the evidence indicates there. He does concede that, of course, that's not the whole story, but he argues that this is a big part of it, that on page 61, resistance to evolution in America then can be laid completely at the door of religion. Well, there he's taking a fairly strong stand. Completely at the door of religion. You can find some religions without creationism, but you cannot find creationism without religion. Then he says on 61, it's a useful exercise to ask religious people what it would take for them to either abandon their non-negotiables of their faith, like the view that Jesus was divine or that the Quran is the word of Allah, or to give up their faith entirely. Very often you will get the answer, nothing could make me give up those beliefs. As we'll see below, that's one of the many incompatibilities between the attitudes towards religious truth and scientific truth. Scientists are not only constantly looking for evidence that would prove their pet theories wrong, but often know exactly what kind of evidence would do it. There are no non-negotiables in science. That seems like a pretty stark contrast between religion and science.
Yeah. And I think that statistic at the bottom of page 60 is telling. I think that really gets at the heart of the whole book, which is saying, faith and fact are incompatible. If, maybe if there were a larger percentage of people who didn't believe in, or why they denied evolution, because there wasn't enough scientific evidence, then maybe that would be a separate problem. Like, there maybe needs to be a different way to convince people of the evidence that does exist or whatever. But the fact that, as he said, their main reasons are not a lack of evidence, it's their beliefs in religion in general or, theological beings that, kind of partially proves his point that faith and fact are incompatible with one another.
That's his argument. That's exactly right. That's right. So let's see. So that gets us to, the issue of incompatibility, the incompatibility. So he wants to drill down on what he means by science and religion being incompatible. And he begins, it's on page 63, by noting, well, let me first say what I don't mean by incompatibility. I don't mean logical incompatibility, that the existence of religion is simply and a priori incompatible with the practice of science. That's clearly wrong. For in principle, there could be both science and a God to be worshipped. In principle, that could be true. Nor do I mean practical incompatibility, the idea that one simply can't be a religious scientist or a science-friendly believer. That clearly is false as well, for there are many examples of both. Finally, I'm not claiming that religious people are in general opposed to either science in general or the facts it reveals. Although some believers have problems with evolution and cosmology, the vast majority of religious people have no issues like how genetics works, what causes disease and how to treat it, how molecules react chemically with one another, and the principles of aerodynamics. Indeed, nearly everyone in modern societies puts their trust in science every day. And then he gives us a definition of compatibility. This means capable, and he uses the definition from the Oxford English Dictionary again, mutually tolerant, capable of being admitted together, or of existing together in the same subject, accordant, consistent, congruous, agreeable. He says that while science and religion could be considered mutually tolerant, in that some scientists and believers tolerate each other's existence, and could even be seen as capable of being admitted together, as with religious scientists, I don't see them as existing together in the same subject or as accordant, consistent, congruous, or agreeable. This leads to his major claim here. My claim is this, at the bottom of page 64. Science and religion are incompatible because they have different methods for getting knowledge about reality. They have different ways of assessing the reliability of that knowledge, and in the end, arrive at conflicting conclusions about the universe. Knowledge acquired by religion is at odds, not only with scientific knowledge, but also with knowledge professed by other religions. In the end, religion's methods, unlike those of science, are useless for understanding reality. This form of incompatibility is the one expressed, albeit more humorously, by the science writer Natalie Angier in the quote that heads the chapter. So, he argues that along these three domains of if there's a conflict between religion and science in the methods that are used, in the much of it's spent on the methods, on methods that are used, on the outcomes that are generated, by religion and science, and that there's conflicts in the basic philosophy pursued by religion and science. But the largest part of this, the remaining part of this chapter, deals with conflicts of method. Mm-hmm. Is how a religionist or a scientist gets at what may or may not be truth.
Yes. And then did you want to talk about those? I mean, I feel like we've hammered away at faith quite a bit so far.
Right.
Authority is the arbiter of truth. I believe that's where he talks about, religious authorities being like he says, the arbiters or the determinants of what is and isn't true in religion.
There's conflicts there. So in science, there's no place for faith, for belief without evidence. Mm-hmm. It's quite the contrary. In science, you acknowledge or recognize truth to the extent that the evidence is consistent with it. In religion, much, at least as we're talking about it, as Coyne has defined it, faith is how you get knowledge. Not by virtue of hard-won evidence.
Right. There's no investigative process in faith.
Generally speaking. Right. Right. Similarly, there's no role or no place for, sort of an unquestioning authority as the arbiter of truth. Mm-hmm. Science, whereas that's often the case in religion. Science, but not religion, is much more likely to be falsifiable. In fact, a good scientific hypothesis, as many of the students in the class learned in research, is one that is falsifiable. I mean, to the extent that you can't falsify a hypothesis, it's a very poor hypothesis. it doesn't lend itself to advances. Okay? Whereas that's not necessarily true in religion. He mentions what we've already discussed about turning scientific necessities into theological virtues. Oftentimes, so if you document that, the human race did not begin with a single man and a single woman, therefore, if you document that Adam and Eve didn't actually exist, well, one way that many religions have dealt with that is to say, well, we only meant them to be metaphorical people anyways. We didn't actually believe that there really was an Adam and Eve. So you make it a theological, you could, and then, but there are those who argue that, we argue that they did exist, and it's a statement of our faith, how much we believe that we exist despite the evidence to the contrary, that we believe this despite the evidence to the contrary.
Right.
Make it virtuous, which doesn't have any bearing on the truth value of the statements, but it becomes like a badge of honor.
And I feel like that's a pretty common argument, is that
Sure.
That's exactly the case with, plenty of beliefs.
Right.
Or that the evidence is a test of their faith, even sometimes.
Yes, right. I liked Coyne's discussion of the outsider test for faith. This was at the bottom of 85. This is so he's talking about some work by a former preacher, John Loftus, and he says the only rational solution, this is Coyne, says the only rational solution is to apply the same degree of skepticism toward the claims of your own faith as you do toward the ones you reject. This rational and quasi-scientific approach is promoted by the ex-preacher John Loftus, who lays it out briefly, and he calls this the outsider test for faith. Well, I might as well read it. He says, this is Loftus now, it is highly likely that any given religious faith is false, and quite possible that they could all be false. At best, there can only be one religious faith that is true. At worst, they could all be false. So I propose that the only way to rationally test one's culturally adopted religious faith is from the perspective of an outsider, with the same level of reasonable skepticism believers already use to examine other religious faiths that they reject. This expresses what Loftus calls the outsider test for faith. And Coyne continues this. I like Coyne's next statements, if only for clarity of getting a sense of where Coyne's coming from. Coyne says, given that beliefs matter, the wisdom of this approach is unquestionable. But if it's used honestly, its outcome is inevitable. If you're a Christian, for instance, you probably reject the beliefs of Islam because you see them not only as misguided, but also as lacking in evidence. If that's the case, then you must abandon your own faith on the same grounds. In the end, the inconsistencies between faiths combined with the reasonable doubt that believers apply to other faiths means that no faiths are privileged. None should be trusted, and all should be discarded. And he notes that there is no, nor could there be, an outsider test for science.
Right. Right, because there are no different sects of science, so you
Right.
couldn't apply the same methodology to it. But yeah, I actually didn't realize the first time I read this how strong of an argument this is. Because if you have any devout Christian explain to you why they don't believe in, even taking the most ridiculous examples like Scientology or Mormonism, which are all often the most made fun of sort of modern religions, and you ask them to explain why they don't believe in those, then there's no reason that they shouldn't apply the same logic to their own religion and come to the same conclusion of it as, unscientific.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say they would, if they applied that same perspective to their own religion, well, in principle, then Christians would come to much the same conclusion that, billions of Muslims come to, or hundreds of millions, anyways, Muslims come to about Christianity, that it can't be true.
Right.
It can't all be the one true religion. And so therefore, there has to be some means of deciding which one is true. And if that means always boils down to Well, because I know it's true. Well, how do you know it's true? Because that's what it says in the Bible or the Quran. Um, but I don't believe, if you're speaking to somebody who's not a Christian, and you're saying, well, it says it right there in the Bible. Yes, but I'm not a Christian, says the person you're talking to, and therefore I don't recognize the Bible as being the Word of God. Well, but it is the Word of God. Well, how do you know? Well, because my priest told me it was the Word of God. Well, how do you know that he knows? You know what I mean? And so it becomes, there's no way in which one can, reliably detect which one is true. So one possibility is that none of them are.
Right.
I mean, that's the argument anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and he closes up this chapter by addressing conflicts of outcome. Let's see. While most believe, he says right at the beginning here, this is on page 90, while most believers accept the methods of science, they also claim additional methods of apprehending truth, faith, revelation, and authority. If those methods were reliable, then the outcomes of religious and scientific investigations would be similar, or at least consonant, but of course they aren't. Religions make truth claims that have been repeatedly disproved, claims involving both natural and supernatural phenomena. The disproved religious claims involve biology, geology, history, and astronomy, and include these assertions. Animals and plants were created in their present form over a short period of time. False. The earth is young and was once completely inundated by a great flood. False. Modern humans descend from only 2 progenitors. False. Native Americans descend from immigrants from the Middle East. False. These have all been tested. Okay, and Caucasians are the result of a breeding experiment by a black scientist. False. All the evidence is inconsistent with this. Okay, these are all wrong, and it's science, not faith, that has shown them to be wrong. Okay, blah blah blah. Even the historical claims of religion, not counting the various origin myths, are often dubious. Okay, so you get differences in outcome.
Right. Yeah. In like up and down all across the board, basically.
Sure. Let's see, and then in terms of differences or conflicts in philosophy or of philosophy, let's see. I think I want to point students to the paragraph near the bottom of page 94, where he notes, in the end, the incompatibility between the methods of science and religion ultimately yields a genuine philosophical incompatibility. Working scientists are constantly in doubt and criticality, leading to an ingrained skepticism about truth claims. Not a bad thing, really. If you combine that attitude with the proven value of naturalism over the history of science and mix in the repeated failure to find evidence for the supernatural, then you arrive at the following philosophy. Because there is no evidence for supernatural entities or powers, although there could have been such evidence, one is justified in thinking that those entities and powers do not exist. This attitude is called philosophical naturalism. Okay? And then importantly, he notes that it's on the bottom page 95, it's important to realize that philosophical naturalism is, like atheism, a provisional view. It's not a view of certainty, it's a provisional view. Okay? It's not the kind of worldview that says, I know there is no God, but the kind that says, until I see some evidence, I won't accept the existence of gods.
Right. And that's one of the philosophical conflicts he's talking about, is that
Right.
Religion is not provisional in that sense.
That's correct. Then he ends this chapter with I suppose it'll be perceived as controversial, but this paragraph that begins on page 96, he says, the most objectionable thing an American scientist can say about belief is this: science and religion are incompatible and you must choose between them. That's considered objectionable to say that. After all, many people embrace both. And we know that when forced to choose, many would keep their faith. On such grounds, accommodationists argue that forcing that choice is both unseemly and damaging to science. But if you are trying to be consistent in how you get reliable knowledge about the universe, and if you already reject unevidenced claims like those of ESP and homeopathy, okay, or claims of religions other than yours, then in the end, Coyne says you must choose, and choose science. That doesn't mean that you must accept an unchanging set of scientific facts, but simply that you choose reason and evidence over superstition and wish thinking.
Right.
So, again, it's part of what I like about Coyne is that you, the reader, you, the student, us, we don't have to wonder what he's saying. And so much of this literature on religion and science is mealy mouthed. You can't quite figure out what they're saying because nobody wants to offend anybody. But I think there's a lot to be said for the clarity of writing, the clarity of the arguments that Coyne is making. You will know that you disagree with him if you do. You won't have to wonder, do I, don't I? And I think it's important to start on a foundation that you understand what he's saying here.
Yes. No, I agree. And I think he does make it very easy to determine exactly what it is he's saying so that you know if you do agree with him, on what points are you are on what points are you in conflict, because he really doesn't leave anything out.
Right. You mean if you don't agree with if you disagree with it?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean that's right. And so that's exactly what you want. Is you want to have a clear path for how, when, and under what circumstances you disagree with what he's arguing.
Mm-hmm.
And let me be clear that Gavin and I are not interested in you taking on board Coyne's belief system. Okay, that's not the goal. The goal is, what we want you to do is to think critically about and to understand Coyne's arguments. What that may mean is you may sharpen, your thinking about why you disagree.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important. It's important to ask these kinds of questions. And if nothing else, you'll be clear, you as the student, or us as readers, will be clear about why we disagree with them. I just wanted to make that very clear. This is not about a class interested in converting anyone to Coyne's perspective.
Right. And yeah, no, I think that's a good point.
Okay. Well, we've made it through the first two chapters. Spent a little less time this week than in previous weeks, and I think that will likely be true next week as well. So we will end it there today. Is there anything else you wanted to raise, Gavin?
No, that's it for me.
So next time, chapter 3 addresses why, from Coyne's perspective, accommodationism fails. That is the attempt to bring together science and religion. He makes the argument that it fails. It can't be done. That's his argument. Then he addresses the ways in which religion and faith have pushed back against science. And finally, he closes with a chapter, I think a very important chapter, with why it matters. Why it matters that there's conflict between science and religion. And I think that whether you're religious or not, you will find this final chapter very revealing. He raises many issues, many situations in which, it does matter whether or not science and religion are in conflict. And I won't say anything more at this point. But then that'll wrap up Coyne's book. So next week we will finish it up, and Gavin will be posting these talks as well as the videos for this week.
Yep.
And we'll look forward to receiving your discussion questions, your responses to at least 2 other students' questions, and your reaction paper. Right?
Yep, that's correct.
Very good. Okay, well, until next week then, we will see you then.
All right. Thanks.